Bismillah. So I wanted to do a quick book review of the new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 Scientific Discoveries that Reveal the Mind Behind the Universe by Stephen C. Meyer. And you look at a book with this kind of title and this kind of graphic, it's a bit hyperbolic, it's a bit contrived. You know, you might Google the author Stephen Meyer and see the Wikipedia entry that says that he's a advocate of a pseudoscientific creationist argument for the existence of God. So it's easy to kind of just dismiss this and put this on the side until you find out that Stephen Meyer is an incredibly accomplished person. He has a PhD from the University of Cambridge in the philosophy of science. He's the, I guess, head or one of the founders of the Discovery Institute. And he's been on many podcasts, including NPR's podcast, to promote this book. He's been on Michael Shermer's podcast. Michael Shermer is the famous atheist, the head of Skeptic magazine. And Michael Shermer said that when you read this book, it is not your father's creationism. He's saying that this is a competent, complex, evidence-based, science-based argument that's being made for intelligent design, fine-tuning, and teleology. So I jumped into this book last year. It's quite dense. It's about 500 or so pages. I'm not an expert in cosmology or in physics. I've taught some high school science, but I don't have a degree in the hard sciences. So parts of the book are things that I can't really prove or disprove. But the general arguments are quite interesting. So at the beginning of the book, Stephen Meyer talks a little bit about the rise and fall of theistic science and the form, or rather the framing of the science versus religion debate. That, you know, there's always this discussion of there being a clash between religion and science. So he looks at the history of that, framing for that idea, and the rise of scientific materialism and the eclipse of theistic science. And it's pretty interesting. I would say that, he's not primarily a historian per se. I think he overlooks a lot of the Islamic contributions to the scientific method when looking at the history of science. It's kind of a Eurocentric outlook in that initial chapter. But he points out a few interesting things, which is that, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, the consensus among cosmologists was that the universe was eternal. So things like the Kalam cosmological arguments were not convincing even to philosophers like Immanuel Kant. And the kind of contingency arguments and necessarian theology didn't go all the way to convince the scientists of the time. Now, the person that comes up with the Big Bang Theory is the Belgian Catholic priest Meyer in the 1920s. And when he first brought that up, people were accusing him of bringing religion into science and using science to try, that you can't just bring God into things, that things have to be proven using the scientific method, through observation. But Meyer, that's exactly what he did. And it wasn't until Hubble's research just after his that in the 1930s you have Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was, again, early proponent of the universe being eternal until the 1930s, where he actually sees the evidence of the redshift. And the redshift basically is evidence that the galaxies are actually moving further apart from each other and moving further away from us. So that's called Einstein's greatest blunder. And according to David Berlinski, this is not in the book, but David Berlinski claims that, I guess there was another professor that knew Albert Einstein that was saying that Albert Einstein never actually accepted the redshift, even till the end of his life. Obviously, we can't verify that, but just an interesting point that really the discovery of the Big Bang Theory in the 20th century was a major indication to the idea of the universe having a beginning, and kind of bringing back arguments of contingency, bringing back arguments of, there being a creator, a designer, because, just to get back to the book, scientists developed the idea of the Big Crunch. So basically, after a Big Bang, some scientists have proposed that perhaps the universe expands to a certain point, and then it contracts, and then it just keeps repeating in that process. It keeps expanding and retracting. But number one, we can determine that the universe all expanded from a singular point. Number two, we can determine that not only is the universe still expanding, but its rate of expansion is actually accelerating with time. It's not deaccelerating, and there's no evidence that it's actually contracting or that it will contract. So at this point, this is the Big Crunch is really just guesswork. It's just a hypothesis of what might happen, but there is no evidence for it, and there is contrary evidence, again, because the universe is expanding at a faster rate. Similarly, some have proposed like multiverse theories as of late. Simulation hypothesis as well, famously being, spoken about by Elon Musk and Neil deGrasse Tyson and others. But again, that just delays the problem, right, of contingency. Like if this universe came out of another universe, right, that's not a solution necessarily to the problem of the origin of the universe. Lawrence Krauss argues, and Lawrence Krauss actually had a debate with Stephen Meyer at the University of Toronto. Lawrence Krauss argues that the universe came from nothing, but then that begs the question of what is nothing, right? Is nothing just an absence of space-time, of energy? If there's still laws of physics in that philosophical or that material nothingness, then, the physics is something, right? These laws are something. These rules are something. If there's cause and effect, that's still something. So philosophically, the universe coming from nothing at all, including an absence of physics, is pretty incoherent. And the idea of nature, of like nothingness, that nothing produces universes, and that's just the nature of nothing, you're already putting rules on nothing, you see? You need a sufficient cause to get you from A to B. So the multiverse theory, again, which doesn't really have hard evidence, again, like the Big Crunch, doesn't really satisfy the point of if there is a beginning, then this universe must be contingent on something. Now, he talks about revealing the mind behind the universe. So the question is the origin of the universe a lifeless process, a kind of machine that pops out universes, or is it due to an intelligent creator? And that gets to the second part of the book, where he talks about fine-tuning, and he gets into like gravity, like if gravity in the universe had been slightly more powerful or slightly less powerful, then the universe would collapse. If there was less gravity, then the molecules would get further and further apart, and they would not actually be able to come together and form objects in space. Now, obviously, I can't verify a lot of this stuff like independently, not being a scientist or not being a cosmologist anyway. But nonetheless, he makes several fine-tuning arguments about gravity, about other kind of mathematical anomalies, the curvature of space, to show that, this space has been set, like here it is. This is chapter 7. He calls it the Goldilocks universe. Okay, so the universe is just right in order to, or at least the parameters are just right where life or complex forms of life can emerge, and complex chemistry, among other things. And that this is just statistically insignificant or negligible chances of happening. randomly. And then towards the end, or rather towards when he talks about DNA, Stephen Meyer kind of revisits his, claim to fame. He, of course, talks a lot about evolution, and he talks about information in DNA. And he makes a kind of inference to the best explanation, saying that, well, if information exists in DNA, and DNA, is organized in a kind of alphanumeric order, like data, and it carries, these instructions to the proteins, or for the creation of proteins, creation of cells. Like, he's making the argument that inference to the best explanation would suggest that all information, like data, language, code, that all comes from a mind. That if we were to go and see some hieroglyphics, then we would surmise that language is coming from a mind. Or if we were to see code, right, C++ or what have you, we would not say that this happened at random. We would say that came from a mind. Or if we saw a book, like, we would not say that, the trees just all fell apart into the right shape and the right size and produced all of this information. We would say that the book has an author. So he's kind of making a similar claim about the universe, about DNA, about RNA, that there is this complexity of information-bearing properties and the proteins that make life possible. Interestingly, inference to the best explanation as a philosophical principle is something that's used within evolutionary science itself, because it's not like we can observe the evolution, in multi-billion year evolution, 4 billion year evolution of life. We have to look at what physical evidence we have, and we have evidence of, fossil record. We can observe mutation, advantageous mutations over time, similarities between various species of animals and insects, etc. So really, it's an inference to the best explanation that these things adapted over time, over billions of years, because we can put the fossils in the right place. So he's saying, if Darwin's going to use inference to the best explanation, then I can also use it, Meyer is saying, to show that there is a mind behind the complexity of DNA and of fibers and of proteins. He looks at the Cambrian explosion, which, happened over 10 to 20 million years, I think closer to 10 million years, whether that's mathematically possible for unguided random mutation and natural selection to result in that level of speciation, or whether there's other things at play. He brings up, of course, theism and pantheism, among other things, and he looks at arguments made by Krauss and by Stephen Hawking on the origin of the universe. And again, he also is trying to argue towards the end of the book that even deism, deism is the idea that there is a creator, but that creator is not involved in our lives or really much involved in the universe, that there's just a creator God that just kind of created the universe and then, stopped paying attention to it or stopped interfering in it anyway. He's trying to argue that even deism doesn't explain the complexity of DNA, the fine-tuning, teleology, etc. So I actually think it's a very good resource. I highly recommend those of you who are interested in cosmology especially, but also in biology, to check out this book. And yeah, if you guys have any questions about this, or if you guys want more reviews like this, then just let me know. Return of the God Hypothesis. I would actually recommend, at the very least, checking out his podcast with Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer being, again, Atheist Skeptic Magazine. There, the book just fell. Good thing it's not the Quran, right? But that's a good podcast. It's a short conversation. But you can see that Stephen Meyer actually is quite competent at defending and his view and also being fairly original. Also, if you haven't yet checked it out, my book, The Good Shepherd, Jesus Christ and Islam, okay, came out on paperback, available on Amazon, completely off topic, but why not, right? So there you go. It's good to see everybody, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Assalamu alaikum.